Think about the last time, someone gave you some really brutal feedback.
Oh, yeah, the kind where your jaw just instantly tightens up.
Exactly. Your heart starts racing, you get defensive. But what if I told you that in that exact fraction of a second, your brain actually had the opportunity to physically rewire itself?
To rewire for joy and resilience, yeah.
Right. But our defensive reflexes just, well, they totally block it from happening. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are pulling from some really incredible insights in atomic rituals and talent whisperers.
Two fantastic sources.
Yeah, and our mission for you today is to unpack this really profound truth, which is that the way you manage yourself and the way you listen to your own inner voices, it fundamentally rewires how you interact with everyone else in your life.
It really does. It's foundational.
It is. So we're going to take you on a bit of a journey. We'll start with achieving radical candor in the mirror, and then move on to transforming how you physically process criticism.
Which is huge.
Oh, massive. And finally, we'll look at how to use active listening to disarm conflict and build radical trust. So think of this as like your psychological blueprint for becoming a far more resilient and magnetic communicator.
I love that. And it's a blueprint that really has to start from the inside out.
Yeah.
Because, before you can successfully navigate the complexities of other people, you absolutely must lock down how you view yourself.
Right.
You cannot be radically candid with your team or your partner or your friends if you're operating on a foundation of self-deception.
Yeah.
But when we look inward, we usually fall into one of three massive pitfalls of self-perception.
Let's unpack those pitfalls because they are incredibly common. The first one is delusional self-love.
Yes.
Which is essentially just narcissism. It's looking in the mirror and thinking you are already flawless, which, leaves zero room for actual growth.
Right, because you think there's nothing to fix.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then you have the complete opposite extreme, which is self-destructive minimalization. And this is when you are just brutally beating yourself up, dwelling entirely on your flaws until you feel totally paralyzed.
It's so debilitating. And then there's the third one, which...
Well, that third one feels the most insidious to me, honestly. Ruinous self-loving denial.
Yeah, that third one traps so many people. Ruinous self-loving denial is when you pump yourself up with like this artificial positivity just to avoid facing any hard, uncomfortable truths.
Like toxic positivity toward yourself.
Exactly. You're slapping a coat of bright paint over a crumbling foundation. The ultimate goal we're aiming for instead is what the sources call an opportunity-embracing growth mindset.
Which sounds great, but how do we get there?
Well, to test where you currently stand, there's this fascinating and frankly brutal exercise called the self-image assessment.
Oh, this exercise blew my mind when I read it. Walk us through how this actually works in practice, because it's wild.
So you take a standardized list of adjectives, both positive and negative, and you give yourself exactly 30 seconds to highlight only the ones that resonate with how you feel right now.
Just 30 seconds.
Yeah, it forces you to go with your gut. Then comes the really heavy part. You sit facing a mirror,
While looking at yourself?
looking right in your own eyes, and someone else reads the list back to you. But they do it in a highly specific sequence. First, they read all the positive traits that you did not choose.
Which is psychologically devastating because you're sitting there looking at your own face and hearing someone list out all these wonderful qualities, right? Like visionary, courageous, patient.
All the things you actively decided you don't possess.
Right. It instantly highlights your perceived gaps. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, they follow it up by reading the negative traits you did choose.
Yeah. Anxious, impatient, insecure.
It feels like the ultimate confirmation of your own worst fears. Just brutal.
It creates a state of profound vulnerability. But then, the facilitator flips the script entirely. They switch to reading the positive traits you did choose, followed by the negative traits you did not choose.
Oh, wow.
So you hear, you are hardworking,
Yeah.
you are reliable, you are not malicious, you are not lazy, and the psychological whiplash of that is just staggering.
I can imagine.
It proves in real time that your self-concept is highly malleable. It's entirely dependent on where you shine your cognitive spotlight, because both lists are generated from the exact same assessment.
In the exact same 30 seconds of your life.
Exactly. But one leaves you crushed, and the other leaves you deeply empowered.
It's a perfect analogy for checking your dashboard before a massive road trip. If you only stare at the warning lights, the low tire pressure, the check engine icon,
The trip feels doomed.
totally doomed before you even back out of the driveway. You're paralyzed by the potential for failure. But Acknowledging that you also have a full tank of gas, a clear map, and a running engine, well, that completely alters your reality of the journey.
You realize you actually have the resources to move forward.
Exactly.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Dr. Tara Wells' research on mirror meditation dives into the neurology behind this exact phenomenon.
And what does she say about it?
She shows that coming face to face with your own reflection, without turning away and without judging, it builds a specific kind of cognitive resilience.
Hmm.
When you look at yourself and accept the whole picture, the flaws and the strengths, without falling into delusion or destruction, you construct a stable emotional baseline.
You stop running from yourself, basically.
Precisely.
So, okay, let's say you've mastered your own mirror. You're giving yourself radical candor. But the real test isn't when you're alone in your bathroom, right?
No, definitely not.
It's when you step into the office and someone else shoves a terribly distorted, critical mirror right in your face. How does our new baseline survive an external attack? Because dealing with criticism is where, honestly, most of us just fall apart.
Oh, absolutely.
And there is a massive claim to explore in these sources here, the idea that everything, even harsh, unfair criticism or public failure, is fundamentally a gift.
Yeah, and that reframe is not just some feel-good platitude. It's rooted in literal brain chemistry, specifically the process of neuromyelination.
Myelination, break that down for us.
So myelin is a fatty substance that wraps around the axons of your neurons. It acts like insulation on an electrical wire. And the more myelin you have around a neural pathway, the faster and more efficiently those electrical signals travel.
So it's like upgrading a dial-up connection to fiber optics.
That is the perfect way to put it, yeah.
So wait, every time we experience a stressor and consciously choose to process it as an opportunity rather than a threat, we are physically adding insulation to that positive pathway.
Every single time.
Yeah.
By repeatedly practicing positive reframing in the face of criticism, you myelinate the neural pathways associated with resilience, empathy, and analytical thinking. Over time, those responses just become your brain's automatic default setting.
That is wild. There's a beautiful metaphor from Carla McLaren that perfectly illustrates the emotional side of this, actually. She views emotions as a family, and she says joy is the matriarch of the family of emotions.
I love this concept.
Right. But Joy has a strict rule. She absolutely will not enter a house where her children are banished. And her children are sorrow, fear, and anger. So if we lock the door against difficult feedback because it makes us angry or afraid, we inadvertently lock out the joy and the growth, too. We have to let the whole family in.
We really do. And we see a high-octane version of letting that anger in and using it with elite athletes. Think about Michael Jordan's famous, "I took that personally" mindset.
Oh, yeah, the classic meme.
Right. But he is the ultimate example of reframing external doubt or criticism into raw fuel. He didn't internalize an insult as a truth about his identity. He projected it outward and treated it as tuition.
Like data he could use.
Exactly. He extracted every ounce of utility from the hostility to raise his own internal standard of excellence.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to push back a little. Because Michael Jordan playing basketball is one thing, but what about the average person in a toxic corporate environment?
Sure, yeah.
Is it actually healthy to treat every piece of toxic workplace criticism as a gift? Like if a colleague is actively trying to throw you under the bus in a meeting to steal your promotion, doesn't receiving that with a smile and gratitude just invite people to walk all over you?
I'm so glad you brought this up.
Yeah.
Treating it as a gift does not mean validating the attacker's malicious intent. And it absolutely does not mean rolling over to become a doormat.
Okay, so what does it mean in that context?
It is a strategic maneuver to flip the power dynamic. Think of the physics of Aikido.
The martial art.
Right. In Aikido, if someone charges at you and you brace yourself to resist with brute force, you're absorbing the full impact of their energy. You might break. But if you step to the side and neutralize their attack by receiving it with grace, guiding their momentum past you, you remain entirely unharmed. And you are the one in control of the interaction.
Oh, I see. You take the wind right out of their sails.
Right.
By saying, thank you for bringing that perspective to the table. Let's look at the data. You look like the calm, rational professional, and they look unhinged.
Exactly. And you protect your own nervous system. The Sikh warriors, the Akali Nihangs, developed a practice called Khalsai Bole that illustrates this brilliantly.
Khalsai Bole.
Yeah, it's a practice of using bold, fiercely humorous language to recast extreme danger, suffering, or starvation into terms of abundance and bravado. It functions as psychological body armor.
Wait, really? Just by changing the words?
Yes. It is an active linguistic hack that interrupts the amygdala's fear circuits.
So by verbally recasting the nightmare as something manageable or even comical, the brain stops dumping cortisol and adrenaline into your system.
Precisely. The threat becomes a scripted event rather than a chaotic, life-ending horror. So when you face toxic criticism at work, consciously reframing it as a gift of data or a test of your patience, it interrupts your own fight-or-flight response.
So you keep access to your prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. The threat becomes a catalyst for your own cognitive growth, completely independent of whatever nasty intent the attacker had.
That is a massive paradigm shift. So, okay, we've learned to manage our inner saboteurs in the mirror, and we've built this Aikido-like body armor to handle external criticism without crumbling. That secure baseline is what finally allows us to approach other people differently.
Yes, from a place of strength.
Right. Instead of walking into a room holding a defensive shield, we can walk in with radical trust. Which brings us to two core operational concepts in the reading: ACA and API.
ACA stands for Assume Competence and Ability, and API is Assume Positive Intent. Implementing these two principles requires a massive shift from a posture of blame to a posture of genuine curiosity.
I'll be honest, this is where I struggle. In theory, assuming positive intent sounds great, but let's say I'm working with a team member who just keeps dropping the ball.
Right, they're missing deadlines.
Yeah, the work is sloppy. My natural biological instinct is to blame them. I want to assume they're either lazy or they just don't care. How do I practically apply ACA and API in a moment where I am highly frustrated?
You apply it by separating the person from the process. When a project derails, assuming your colleague is incompetent immediately triggers a defensive loop. You attack, they defend, nothing gets solved.
Right, it just turns into an argument.
But if you force yourself to use ACA, assume competence and ability, you start from the premise this person is smart and capable. So what systemic, contextual, or resource factors cause this suboptimal outcome? You investigate the workflow, the communication chains, or the timeline.
Oh, that makes so much sense. It's like assuming the person who just cut you off in traffic is rushing to the hospital, not just being a jerk.
Yes, exactly.
It completely lowers your own blood pressure before you even type out that angry Slack message. You approach them asking, "What roadblock did you hit?" instead of, "Why didn't you do your job?"
And that approach taps directly into what actually motivates human beings. If you look at Dan Pink's research on motivation, the three intrinsic drivers are autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Okay.
Think about a workplace where API is missing. Without the assumption of positive intent, autonomy devolves into isolated silos because no one trusts anyone else with the task.
Wow, yeah.
Mastery is completely stifled because employees are terrified to take risks or admit mistakes for fear of judgment. And purpose feels entirely hollow if you suspect leadership or your peers have cynical ulterior motives.
You can actually see this exact dynamic play out in professional sports, too. Look at Phil Jackson, the legendary basketball coach. He didn't just hand out playbooks and scream at his players to comply with his orders.
Right, the Zen master approach.
Exactly. He took the time to explain the purpose behind a specific offensive triangle. He trusted his players' underlying competence, and by doing that, he avoided that natural human resistance to authority and empowered them to actually own the strategy on the court. He traded mere compliance for total empowerment.
It fundamentally changes the physiological state of an entire organization. When people feel inherently trusted, they expend zero energy protecting their egos. All of that cognitive power is redirected into contributing their best creative efforts.
So, assuming positive intent is our internal posture. But what does this all mean for our daily conversations? Like, how do we make the other person actually feel that safety in real time? That brings us to curiosity reciprocity.
Yes.
The idea that genuine open-ended interest is biologically contagious.
It is deeply contagious.
Yes.
Curiosity reciprocity is a phenomenon where your demonstration of genuine interest in another person's perspective actively lowers their psychological threat level. It invites them, almost compels them, to return the curiosity.
Like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. We are always operating in one of two loops. There's the defensive loop, where certainty and attack invite counterattack, causing cognitive narrowing. Then there's the curiosity loop, where openness invites more openness, expanding the possibilities for resolution.
There's an old Zen parable that captures the danger of that defensive loop perfectly. The story of the empty cup.
Oh, I love this one.
Right. A learned professor visits a Zen master named Nanin to inquire about Zen. Nanin pours the professor a cup of tea, but he just keeps pouring until the tea overflows the cup and spills all over the table.
Just completely making a mess.
Yeah. And the professor finally yells, "It's over full. No more will go in." And Nanan calmly replies, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?"
It perfectly illustrates the barrier of absolute certainty. If you enter a conversation already entirely full of your own rightness, there is absolutely no room for new understanding to enter.
And there is a brilliant real-world example of emptying the cup from a fifth-grade classroom in the text. The teacher asks the class, "Who discovered America?" And the whole room naturally yells out, "Christopher Columbus."
Right, the standard answer.
Now, the teacher could have just corrected them, told them they were wrong, and triggered that defensive loop where the kids feel stupid. Instead, she simply turns to the most confident student and asks, "How do you know that?"
But a great question.
And the student pauses, thinks, and says, "Our teacher last year told us." The simple act of asking how shifted the entire room from fiercely defending a fixed answer to engaging in a shared inquiry about where our knowledge comes from.
What's fascinating here is the neuroscience beneath that interaction. Curiosity and defensiveness are transmitted through microsignals long before our brains even parse the vocabulary being used.
Microsignals. Like what?
A tightened jaw, a clipped pace of speech, a sharp inhale. These microsignals transmit a threat state. The receiver's amygdala picks up on it instantly. But a slower cadence, a relaxed facial posture, a genuine open question, these physically stabilize the other person's nervous system.
So you are literally signaling safety.
Yes, allowing their brain to move out of self-protection and back into the prefrontal cortex for exploration.
So, to genuinely empty our cup, signal safety, and invite that curiosity reciprocity, we need practical tools. Because just telling someone to be curious isn't enough when emotions are running hot.
No, it takes practice.
We have to look at the actual mechanics of active listening and powerful questions. Let's slow down and break these tools apart, starting with one of my absolute favorites, the optometrist's approach.
This is a phenomenal tool for clarifying murky communication. When someone is struggling to articulate a complex feeling or a multifaceted problem, you offer them two distinct interpretations of what you just heard. Is it more like this or is it more like that?
It's literally like being at the eye doctor. Better one or better two.
Exactly.
Let's role play this so you can hear how it works. Let's say I come to you and I'm venting. I say, "I'm just so frustrated with the marketing team. Everything is a mess and I hate this project. I haven't really given you anything useful to work with. I'm just emotional."
Right. And instead of me saying, "Well, what's wrong with it?"
Mm-hmm.
which feels accusatory, I use the optometrist approach. I'd say, "It sounds really overwhelming. Let me ask you, is the frustration more about the timeline being too tight, or is it more about the creative direction feeling off?"
And it takes all the pressure off me to be perfectly articulate on my first try. I can just react and say, "Oh, definitely the timeline. The creative is fine, but we're rushing. You've helped me dial in the focus without making me feel interrogated."
It's so effective.
Now, what happens when I give you an answer, but you can tell there's more beneath the surface? That's where the pregnant pause comes in.
The pregnant pause.
Yeah.
It is the intentional, sustained use of silence immediately after a person answers a question.
Yeah.
And it is incredibly difficult to execute because human beings despise the void.
We really do. We just want to jump in.
Our brains want to fill the silence. But if you can force yourself to hold that silence for 3, 4, even 5 seconds, the other person will almost always step in to fill it. And when they do, they usually uncover a deeper, more vulnerable truth that they were initially holding back. It signals that you have infinite patience for their truth.
But sometimes, even with silence, people are stuck in their own narratives. They're spinning their wheels. How do we break them out of that without triggering their defenses? That brings us to the gentle jolt.
Yes, the gentle jolt utilizes provocative, slightly disruptive questions to test a person's readiness for change. It bypasses the standard defense mechanisms. A powerful example is asking, "What are you pretending not to know right now?" Or, "What is the cost of staying fiercely loyal to this story you're telling yourself?"
What are you pretending not to know? That is a heavy, heavy question. It forces you to stop blaming external factors and look at your own complicity.
It really does.
And if we want to turn that analytical lens on ourselves for self-management, there is a brilliant tool called Goldilocks and the 6 chairs.
I love this one.
You literally imagine placing your complex problem on a table, and you mentally sit in 6 different chairs to get advice from wildly different perspectives. You ask, what would my 80-year-old self say about this? What would Nelson Mandela say? Or, my absolute favorite, What would my Subaru Outback say?
I know asking a car for advice sounds eccentric, but the psychological mechanism is highly effective. It forces extreme cognitive flexibility.
Right.
What does a Subaru Outback represent? Reliability, all-weather endurance, function over form. By externalizing the problem and adopting that specific persona, you break out of your own rigid, anxious thought patterns. You ask, how do I make this project weatherproof? It completely shifts your paradigm.
All of these tools, the optometrist, the pause, the jolt, the chairs, they are all in service of what is called transformational listening. This is the pinnacle of the practice. It's listening in three distinct dimensions.
Correct. Dimension 1, you are listening for what is actually being said. Dimension 2, you are actively listening for what is not being said.
Yeah.
The omissions, the hesitations.
The stuff between the lines.
Exactly. And Dimension 3, you are listening for what is trying to emerge. You aren't just extracting data to form your next reply.
Yeah.
You are holding a psychological space where new awareness can actually be born for both of you.
So let's tie this entire journey together for you. We started by looking in the mirror, acknowledging the positive and the negative, and facing ourselves with radical candor.
Building that baseline.
Right. From that secure baseline, we learned to reframe external adversity and toxic criticism as gifts, myelinating our brains for resilience. And finally, by approaching the world with ACA, API, and true active listening, you don't just survive conversations, you create this massive ripple effect. You transform your team, your relationships, and your entire culture just by changing your internal posture and the questions you ask.
It is the ultimate systemic lever. But if we pull back, this entire methodology raises a fascinating philosophical question. There's an addendum in the research regarding human-AI dialogue that perfectly mirrors this human dynamic.
Oh, this is so interesting. Tell us about that.
When we prompt an artificial intelligence with a simple, closed-ended command, like summarize this data, the AI stays in what is called execution mode. It acts transactionally. It gives you the literal data, and it stops.
Right. It's no different than treating a colleague like a calculator. You get exactly what you asked for and nothing more.
Exactly. But when we use powerful, open-ended prompts with that same AI, when we provide context, assume its processing capacity, and ask it to challenge our underlying assumptions, the AI shifts into transformational inquiry mode.
Wow.
It stops being a calculator and becomes a deep, reflective partner capable of highly nuanced systemic analysis. The underlying machinery didn't change. The quality of the interaction changed because of the input.
We've spent this whole time talking about how asking the right questions transforms human interactions. But if practicing active listening and asking powerful questions to a literal machine can yield profound, nuanced truths, what does that say about our own minds?
It's a compelling and humbling parallel.
Are we, too, just stuck in execution mode every single day, waiting until we finally learn to ask ourselves the right questions?
The depth of the reality you experience is entirely dependent on the depth of the inquiry you are willing to make.
Which brings us right back to that mirror in your bathroom. If you're tired of seeing a distorted, frustrating reflection of your life and your relationships, maybe it's time to stop blaming the glass and start asking yourself better questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Be honest for a second. How many times have you read, like, a brilliant leadership book or maybe listened to a self-improvement talk and immediately thought, wow, this perfectly explains exactly what is wrong with my boss?
Oh, or your sister. Or your brother.
Right, exactly. Like, this is the precise reason my coworker is just so frustrating to deal with. You absorb all these complex frameworks about, dysfunctions and toxic habits, and you instantly use that fresh knowledge to expertly diagnose every single flaw in your coworkers, your friends, and your family.
It happens almost by default, to all of us. We get a new conceptual framework, and suddenly we possess this brand new lens to view the world. But we almost exclusively point that lens outward.
Yeah, always outward.
Right. Because categorizing the faults of other people is incredibly comforting. It requires absolutely no vulnerability on our part.
It provides this little dopamine hit, honestly. You sit in a meeting, you cross your arms, and you think, Greg clearly lacks psychological safety, and his communication style is, purely defensive.
Never, Greg.
I know, right? But it feels so good to armchair diagnose a frustrating colleague. But the moment you are asked to turn that exact same diagnostic lens on yourself, well, the dopamine just vanishes.
It evaporates completely.
Suddenly, it is profoundly uncomfortable. And that tension really brings us to the core of our deep dive today. We are exploring a concept sourced from the Talent Whisperers blog, specifically an article examining what happens when we practice Radical Candor in the Mirror.
And the author sets up this entire premise with a story that just perfectly captures the exact hypocrisy we are talking about here. They were working with Brad Smith, who is the CEO of Intuit at the time.
Oh, right.
And Brad, trying to be a proactive leader, he hands out copies of Patrick Lencioni's famous leadership book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, to his staff.
Which is, I mean, that's a classic corporate move, handing out the homework.
Oh, totally. But the author points out to the CEO that he actually forgot to hand out a crucial piece of equipment to go along with the book. He should have handed everyone a physical mirror.
I love that so much.
Because handing someone a book about team dysfunction without a mirror is basically handing them a magnifying glass to scrutinize everyone else. It just becomes a weapon to use against your teammates.
Which really highlights a fundamental human bias. Spotting the flaws in others is, well, it's an automated process. It takes zero cognitive load.
Exactly.
But recognizing the opportunities for improvement within ourselves, however, that requires overriding our natural psychological defenses. The author of the piece realized this gap was so profound that they actually started physically gifting a mirror alongside leadership books.
Which is such a powerful visual.
It really is. But to understand why looking in that mirror triggers so much resistance, we have to look at the specific communication framework the author is applying here.
Right, because radical candor isn't just a buzzword. I mean, it's a very specific, highly influential 2x2 framework developed by Kim Scott and was originally designed strictly for managers giving feedback to their direct reports.
It's all about how you deliver the message.
Yeah, the premise is that the most effective communication happens when you combine two specific dimensions. You have to care personally while simultaneously challenging directly.
And those two dimensions are critical because they balance our natural instincts, right? If you challenge directly, but you don't care personally, you fall into what they call obnoxious aggression.
You're just being a jerk.
Basically, yeah, under the guise of honesty. Like, the feedback might be accurate, but the recipient's fight or flight response is triggered so they don't absorb it anyway.
Right, they just shut down. And on the flip side, if you care personally, but you fail to challenge directly, you fall into ruinous empathy.
Which is so common.
It really is. You withhold vital feedback to keep the peace, and the person ultimately fails because, well, you didn't tell them what they needed to fix.
So radical candor hits the sweet spot. You build enough trust through caring that the person can actually hear the hard truth they need to improve. But traditionally, this entire framework is outward-facing. It is a tool for fixing other people.
And that's where the Talent Whisperers piece takes this established management tool and pivots it inward. Like, what happens when we apply radical candor to ourselves in service of our own growth?
That internal pivot is where psychology gets really complicated. Because to apply radical candor to yourself, you kind of have to split your consciousness.
Yes.
You have to be both the manager giving the hard feedback and the employee receiving it at the same time. You have to care personally about your own well-being while simultaneously challenging directly your own behaviors and flaws.
But wait, let me push back on that a little bit. Isn't the data set corrupted from the start?
How do you mean?
Well, we are incredibly unreliable narrators of our own lives. We are, by definition, the most biased judges of our own behavior. If I try to give myself feedback, my ego is inherently involved.
Oh, completely.
I'm going to either let myself completely off the hook because I know my own intentions, or I'm going to act like my own worst enemy. There is no objective middle ground naturally.
You nailed it. And that corrupted data set is exactly what makes this so dangerous. When we look in the mirror without safety guardrails, our brain's defense mechanisms just take over.
We don't default to radical candor.
We absolutely do not naturally land in radical candor. Instead, the author warns that our inherent self-bias forces us into one of three very specific negative failing states. These are traps, essentially, and they happen when we strip away either the caring personally or the challenging directly when we evaluate ourselves.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of these three traps, because the psychology of why our brains do this is fascinating. The first trap the author identifies is delusional self-love.
Which sounds kind of great, honestly.
Right, but conceptually, this is pure narcissism. Mechanically, this is what happens when someone looks in the mirror and genuinely believes there is absolutely no room for growth. They are already the finished product.
Right. Mechanically, delusional self-love is an ego preservation strategy. The brain just cannot tolerate the vulnerability of being wrong or being flawed. So it builds an impenetrable fortress of superiority.
In the 2x2 matrix, this person has completely abandoned the challenge, directly access. There is zero self-interrogation. They look in the mirror and only see the illusion they have projected.
Delusional self-love is, it's that person in a college group project who is genuinely convinced they're the only one doing the work correctly.
Oh my gosh, yes. We all know that person.
We all know one. They're completely blind to the fact that they are actually the bottleneck causing all the delays. But instead of self-reflecting, they sit there fuming that they have to carry the team because acknowledging their own incompetence would shatter their entire sense of identity.
That identity protection is key. The ego is so heavily armored that actual self-reflection just bounces right off. But if delusional self-love is an over-armored ego, the second trap is an entirely stripped ego. The text calls this self-destructive minimalization.
This is when we look in the mirror and relentlessly attack ourselves. We fixate on every flaw, real or imagined, and use it as evidence that we're simply not good enough.
It is a dark place to be.
Very. It is a state devoid of hope, where you just give up and see everyone else as vastly superior to you.
Psychologically, this is your brain's negativity bias going into hyperdrive. You are challenging directly, sure, but you have completely removed the caring personally component. It is pure, unadulterated punishment.
Just beating yourself up.
Exactly. And strangely, this is also a defense mechanism. It is a preemptive strike. The subconscious logic is if I destroy myself first, if I tell myself I'm worthless, then the external world can't surprise me or hurt me with failure.
Wow, so it is a twisted form of self-protection. If delusional self-love is the arrogant group project guy, self-destructive minimalization is like tearing down your entire house because you found one termite in the baseboards.
That is a great way to put it.
You zero in on one singular flaw and use it as absolute proof that the entire structure is rotten and should be condemned. You challenge the termite, but you have no care for the house.
And that brings us to the third trap, which is arguably the most insidious because, unlike the first two, it actually feels incredibly pleasant in the moment. The author calls this ruinous, self-loving denial.
Wait, why is it ruinous? It sounds like standard self-care, like take a bubble bath, forgive yourself.
It masquerades as self-care, for sure, but its actual mechanism is avoidance. This trap is driven by cognitive dissonance. Imagine you believe you are a highly responsible professional, but you just completely dropped the ball and missed a critical deadline.
Okay, that feels terrible.
It does. Your brain experiences intense psychological friction between your identity and your reality. Ruinous denial is the psychological airbag that deploys to save your ego from that impact. You pump yourself up, you remind yourself how hard you have been working, and you rationalize the failure away to soothe the friction.
So you completely drop the challenge directly part of the equation. You use the language of self-empathy to shield yourself from accountability.
Exactly.
Ruinous denial is like taking a heavy painkiller for a broken ankle and then deciding you are ready to run a marathon because it doesn't hurt anymore. You are using self-soothing to mask the symptom, but you are completely ignoring the actual fracture.
The painkiller analogy is spot on. It is ruinous because in the short term, the pain stops. Your ego is intact. But long term, you run on a broken ankle, you never address the missed deadline, you never fix your time management, you stagnate entirely under the guise of being kind to yourself.
Okay, so we have these three highly automated traps. The ego fortress of delusional self-love, the preemptive strike of self-destructive minimalization, and the psychological airbag of ruinous denial.
Right.
If our brains naturally default to these three dead ends just to protect us, what does a healthy, accurate reflection actually look like?
Well, the source material defines a fourth ideal state to escape the traps. They call it the opportunity-embracing growth mindset. This is the internal equivalent of true radical candor.
Okay, break that down for me.
You intentionally look in the mirror to seek out areas of improvement. That's the challenge directly piece, but you do it while maintaining the deep-seated belief in your inherent capacity to improve incrementally over time. That is the care personally piece.
Wait, let me interrogate that for a second. How does an opportunity embracing growth mindset not just slide right back into ruinous denial?
That is a very fair question.
Because opportunity embracing sounds a lot like giving myself a pass. Both states involve being highly supportive of yourself after a failure. Where is the actual line?
The absolute dividing line is the presence of candor. Ruinous denial looks at a failure and says, well, that wasn't my fault. I was just stressed. I'm still doing great. It rejects the reality of the flaw.
Right.
A growth mindset looks at the exact same failure and says, I dropped the ball on that presentation because I avoided doing the hard research. That is a flaw in my current work ethic. You do not flinch from the ugly truth.
But then how do you not just spiral into trap number 2 and start hating yourself?
Because instead of letting that truth trigger self-destructive minimalization, You attach it to neuroplasticity and hope. You say, that is my flaw today, but I have the mechanical ability to build a better research habit tomorrow. You separate your identity from the behavior.
Ah, I see. So candor without hope becomes self-destructive. Hope without candor becomes ruinous denial. You have to bridge the two to get actual human transformation.
Perfectly said.
And I really want to highlight the word incrementally here. We aren't talking about looking in the mirror, finding a deep-seated behavioral flaw, and instantly becoming a completely different person by Tuesday. The expectation of overnight transformation usually just feeds right back into the self-destructive trap when we inevitably fail.
Transformation is an iterative process. It takes time. But recognizing that conceptually is entirely different from executing it practically. And this is where the source material introduces a really fascinating pivot.
Tell me more.
Up to this point, we have been discussing the mirror as a metaphor for self-reflection, but the author introduces hard psychological science that suggests this isn't just an abstract leadership theory.
Right, because conceptually, I understand the growth mindset, but practically, sitting alone in my home office trying to objectively assess my own flaws almost always spirals into trap number 2, for me just beating myself up.
It is so hard to stay neutral.
The internal monologue just gets way too loud. How do you actually force your brain to stay objective and compassionate at the same time?
You can't do it just by thinking harder. You actually have to hijack your brain's evolutionary social wiring. And that is where the author brings in the research of Dr. Tara Well.
She's an associate professor of psychology at Barnard College of Columbia University, right?
Yes. And Dr. Well has dedicated years of neuroscience research to something called mirror-based meditation.
The New York Times actually covered her work and called the practice a revelation. But I have to admit, the idea of literally sitting down and staring into a physical mirror for an extended period sounds incredibly intimidating.
It is very intense for a lot of people.
Because we use mirrors to check for spinach in our teeth or fix our hair. We look at ourselves, we don't look into our own eyes. It feels intensely vulnerable.
What is the mechanism here? Why is physical mirroring so much more effective than just sitting with your eyes closed and thinking?
The mechanism relies on how the human nervous system regulates emotion. We are highly social primates. Our brains have dedicated neural pathways, like the fusiform face area, specifically designed to process facial expressions.
So we are wired to look at faces.
Exactly. Throughout our evolutionary history, we have relied on looking at the faces of our tribe members to co-regulate our nervous systems. If the tribe looks calm, our parasympathetic nervous system engages, and we relax.
Okay, so when we are stressed or being self-critical, our fight or flight system is active. We are waiting for a calm face to tell us we are safe.
Yes, but when you are alone in your own head, spiraling into self-criticism, there is no external face to calm you down. Furthermore, when you just sit and think, your brain activates the default mode network, or the DMN. I've heard of that. It's like the brain's idling state, right?
Exactly. The DMN is the brain's background chatter, and for most people, it is highly critical. It is the part of the brain that loops that argument you had 3 years ago while you were in the shower.
Oh, I hate that part of the brain. So if I try to practice radical candor purely in my head, the default mode network hijacks the process and turns it into self-destructive minimalization.
Yes. But Dr. Well's research shows that when you physically look into your own eyes in a mirror, you force a neurological override. You become both the subject and the object of observation.
Wait, really? Just by looking?
Just by looking. By intentionally holding a compassionate gaze toward your own reflection, you are feeding your brain's facial recognition system the exact social cue it needs to calm down. You actively trigger the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system.
That is wild. We are literally hacking our neurobiology. By physically looking at our own face with compassion, we are chemically forcing the brain to merge the care-personally axis with whatever hard truth we are trying to face.
You are grounding your abstract internal dialogue in physical reality. Dr. Well's research proves that this practice actively downregulates the amygdala.
The fear center.
Right, which fights despair and overcomes deep-seated self-criticism. It builds a neurological foundation of self-compassion. When you literally look yourself in the eye, it becomes mechanically much harder for the brain to ruthlessly tear you down because your visual system is forcing a level of humanity back into the evaluation.
It takes the corporate jargon of radical candor and turns it into a profound psychological intervention. If you can sit in front of a mirror and say, I really messed up that client relationship because I was arrogant, while maintaining eye contact and a compassionate facial expression, you are perfectly executing the opportunity, embracing growth mindset.
Yes, you are.
You're staring directly at the flaw, but your nervous system is calm enough to actually begin the incremental work of fixing it.
It brings the entire concept full circle back to the Intuit CEO anecdote. The author's intention to gift a physical mirror alongside leadership books isn't just a clever metaphor. It is a necessary tool to force the brain out of its outward-blaming default state.
Because reading a chapter on toxic communication and immediately picturing your boss's face is effortless.
No, it is so easy.
The brain loves that. It requires no cognitive dissonance, no nervous system regulation, and no vulnerability. But true human transformation does not begin by accurately diagnosing the person sitting across from you at the conference table.
It really doesn't.
It begins when we possess the radical candor to look at our own reflection, bypass the ego protection of delusional self-love, refuse the airbag of ruinous denial, and actually recognize our own opportunities for incremental growth.
Shifting from outward judgment to inward accountability is the hardest pivot a professional or simply a human being can make. But it is the only pivot that actually moves the needle on your own development.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the mirror, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Think about the most acute friction point in your life right now. Maybe it is a specific dynamic at work, a strategic project that keeps stalling, or maybe a relationship that constantly drains your energy.
We all have one.
Exactly. If you were to hold a literal, physical mirror up to that exact frustration, how much of that dysfunction would reflect back as something you actually have the power to incrementally improve in yourself?